The death of God is about the drying up of a horizon of meaning and of a whole form of human life.
Where do we stand in the illusion it makes? What kind of space are we invited into?
The material relations between people become social relations between things. When we look at toasters, corn, and TVs,
we still, to a large extent, live in the interregnum between worlds, if you will, or between paradigms. Not many people in the history of the world have faced that.
Diet Soap is a Sublation Media podcast. Chris Bateman is a game designer, outsider philosopher, and author, best known for the games Discworld Noir and Ghostmaster. And he's written books such as Chaos Ethics, The Mythology of Evolution, and Imaginary Games. Those are games that were published by Zero Books. We are about to host Chris Bateman's videos, a series of videos that he's put together called, what was the name of the video series? It was like Dr. Multiverse's
Dr.
Lessons,
Multiverse, Renegade Philosopher.
And it's an interesting series. I suspect that it will be a bitter pill for some to swallow to watch your videos, but I think it's worthwhile. I also imagine that there will be some Zoomers and maybe young millennials in the audience that will think, oh, look, more boomer content. You're not a boomer, I don't think. You're the same age as I am, roughly.
I'm not, but my dog's name is Boomer, so there is a connection.
Yeah, but I have discovered that even if you're Generation X, for young people today, we're all boomers. Anyone over the age of 40.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? The Generation X is now old enough that we can be lumped in with people who were born like 40 years earlier than us.
Oh God.
Yeah, okay. Sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel as old as I feel, but
yeah. Well, no, I feel as I'm sure that I do feel as old as you feel, or older every day. Okay. But let's get going, because I want to ask you about your series. I want to introduce you to everybody because we're going to be releasing this series of videos.
Can I thank you for running the videos, Doug? I really appreciate this. I really needed an outlet when I recorded these in November, and I was very grateful to you for the opportunity to let some of this out, and in a form that might expose me to people who wouldn't normally come across my philosophy. So
I'm glad to do it. I remember at the time I told you I wish that I could do it on a bigger channel. But this one's growing. We'll see how these do.
I rather feel that if you had the bigger audience, it would just increase the size of the backlash against me, which might not be what I should want.
That's true. But all right. But okay. So let's talk about the videos, because, first of all, what is the meaning of the name? Why Dr. Multiverse?
That idea had never came into my head, but as I was thinking I'm going to be doing a video series, I thought, well, I've got to have something that works in the title that has a little bit of tongue in cheek in it, and the part of my philosophy that I think is most central now to what I do is this concept of a moral multiverse, which I explained in the first episode where it comes from. I'm not sure if I want to repeat it there, but I get it from Michael Moorcock, and also from William James, who also uses the term multiverse. And William James uses it in the same sense that I do, although it's also in Moorcock's novels as well. Moorcock is a huge influence on me. My nan bought me the first of the Swords of Coram books. These are they're sword and sorcery stories. They're swashbuckling tales of adventure, but they're also existentialist novels, because Moorcock was hugely influenced by, Camus in particular. And this existentialism runs through it. As a 9-year-old, it was completely above me. But as time went on, I began to appreciate more and more what Moorcock was trying to do in these books. And it hugely influenced me. And Chaos Ethics, in some respects, is my tribute to Moorcock, although it draws from all sorts of other stuff. So this idea of the moral multiverse, everyone now thinks about the multiverse in terms of the physicists' multiverse, the science fiction multiverse, all these different parallel dimensions. But we already have a whole bunch of parallel worlds. It's the different worlds that we all live in. I like to say that we live in different worlds, but we all live in the same multiverse. And that's the sort of grounding idea behind my attempts in political philosophy, is attempts to recognize that we are all living in the same multiverse, even though the worlds we live in might be very, very different. In fact, they are very, very different. And we've got very bad at communicating between those worlds. And although there are several candidates for my mutant power, I think the most likely mutant power is that I will talk to anyone, which in fact is very difficult to do, and most people can't do it. Most people will fly into a rage against many people who live in a different world to them. I find that I can speak to anyone. I won't necessarily like what they have to say, but I can talk to anyone, and that seems to be my mutant power. So hence my superhero persona of Dr. Multiverse, with this extraordinary and entirely useless ability to talk to anyone. But my hope is that by being willing to talk to anyone and everyone, that I might actually do some good, or at least create some conversations that couldn't happen otherwise.
Well, I would like to say that I also can talk to anyone, but shamefully, I only speak English. I'm interested in Michael Moorcock. I want to go on a little tangent here for a moment, because
Sure.
I think of Michael Moorcock as primarily a new wave science fiction writer.
Absolutely.
And he pumped out a bunch of fantasy novels for pennies on the word, but then there was some serious work.
70-odd novels in the Eternal Champion series, which is a set of different books that cross over with each other. Yeah,
but the book that I read is Behold the Man.
Right, which was a Nebula winner, I believe.
Yeah, and it was about I think it was about a time traveler that went back to witness the crucifixion of Christ. Am I correct about that?
Yes. So I've spoken to Moorcock quite a lot about Behold the Man, actually, because it's an interesting book. He did not expect that this would be as offensive as it was to many of the Christians who read it, because, spoilers, if you haven't read it, the time traveler ends up taking the role of Jesus and being crucified. And Moorcock's point is the existentialist point that Jesus was a product of his circumstances, that the circumstance of the time created this role. But of course, this doesn't take into account the sort of theological implications of every aspect of the Jesus story, and that, of course, made that book very, very offensive to a lot of Christians. Although I think, to be frank, the fact that it was offensive to many Christians was part of the reason for its enormous success. I do think it's a really interesting book. I do think it would be something that many people would find offensive. It wouldn't be what I'd suggest as an entry point into Moorcock's output. But it's a very odd and unusual book, and it features a bizarre cameo by the Isle of Wight, where I grew up. And this is not a location that appears very often in literature, so that was also a strange experience for me reading it when I was younger.
He published a anthology. He was the editor of an anthology series, if I'm correct.
New Worlds, yeah. It was the New Wave literature magazine. And in fact, you mentioned all of these fantasy novels that Moorcock cranked out. He's quite upfront about this. He cranked them out to get the minimum advance from the publisher in order to keep working on the magazine. So in order to pay his way to keep New Worlds running, he would go up to his publishers and say, right, what's the shortest manuscript you'll take? 40,000 words? 3 days later, there's a 40,000 word science fiction or fantasy novel. Off you go. And I don't want to suggest that these novels aren't great to read, because they are, but they were cranked together quickly. And in some cases, as I joke with Moorcock, you can tell, but they're still incredible stories. And as a set together, you take the set together as a megatext, and it's even more remarkable.
This is something that
also who's had literary success. He's not only a sci-fi fantasy writer. I mean, he won the did he win, or was he nominated for the Whitbread? I think he was only nominated for the Whitbread with Mother London, which is absolutely astonishing.
I've written 3 novels. I'm 51 years old. I have 3 novels to my name. And I resent the fuck out of Michael Moorcock, I just want to say. and Barry Malzberg too, fuck both those guys. They're both brilliant, and they could pump out books. And I don't know how they did it.
I think it's worth remembering that although this huge number of books come out of Moorcock during mostly in the 60s and 70s when he's writing the shorter novels, you would not get a book of that length accepted as a novel these days, right?
True.
So 40,000 words is a novella, right? I don't know how long your books are, but I think they're about 120,000 words. Was that in the ballpark?
Of my books?
Yeah.
No, they're like 70,000 words.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yes, but you shouldn't measure literature by its weight in words, right? It's
the size doesn't matter. That's what they keep telling me. but the point here is that I remember coming across Michael Moorcock, discovering that he was a pioneer of new wave fiction, which I admired in the 90s, and I still admire. And then realizing that he was also the kind of author, and so many of these people were, who could just pump out story and pump out the word count and write coherently.
Yeah.
For me, just to write coherently is a struggle. So to write coherently at that pace.
Add to that you're doing it on a classical typewriter, right? So you've got to be considerably more accurate if you're going to deliver these things swiftly, because you've got to get it all in more or less one pass. I mean, you can make corrections, but you know how it was with the typewriter. It's not like word processors. We are lazy these days. The word processors have made us very, very lazy. Although actually, for me, it's had the reverse effect, because as I was confessing to you on another occasion, I spend ages editing it and going over and over it, long beyond any sense of logic of the number of rounds of edits. But there's something really satisfying about that editing process that, in fact, would be horrific if I was trying to do it on a classical typewriter.
You just wouldn't do it.
You wouldn't. And the typewriter is one of the reasons why I think Moorcock's output is so vast, is that the typewriter invited that sort of means of production for texts, if you see what I mean. It was a very different way of writing.
Because you were kind of pressured to stay with your first draft a bit more? Is that
it was more important that your first draft was in the ballpark. So you might do, and Moorcock did. He did quite a lot of groundwork before starting work on the writing, but he'd do the groundwork, then do the first draft, and then read it through and make annotations or add pages where necessary. But that's not how we write novels these days, or books these days. You can wade in and organize it later. I mean, at least one of those zero books, philosophy books you mentioned earlier, the original structure that I had for it and the structure that I eventually published, completely different, because I think it might have been Chaos Ethics, because I started Chaos Ethics knowing everything I was going to say, and then about halfway through, the thing just got a life of its own, and it started. I don't make it sound mad as it started telling me to do things differently, but the flow of the text required me to reorganize it and restructure it. By the end, I'd said things in that book that I'd never intended to say, but which were the right things to say in that book, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
But it was the word processor that allowed me to do that. If it hadn't been for the luxury of this enormous capacity to rearrange, I can't imagine that book would have been anything like that.
When I was in between my first novel and my second novel, I discovered Slavoj Žižek, and one of the things that he said that for him that helped him to write. Now I was a fiction writer. It's not the same, but he said what he would do is he would not write. He would take notes and he would edit. So he would sit down and he'd take notes on his idea in relatively complete sentences, and then when he was done writing all the notes, he'd go through and he'd edit them, and that would be his book. And so that's how when I write, that's how I try to write these days. It makes it easier. I think it helps you get overcome the writer's block. But that is very much the technique of someone who has a word processor.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, listen, I'm not sure. I think we're far afield of talking about your videos in a way, but I guess in a way we're not, because one of the things that you can notice about what we've been saying in this conversation is that the circumstances you're in, the material foundation, or the materials available to you, including technology, all these things shape who you are and how you communicate, how you think.
Absolutely.
Michael Moorcock is a typewriter guy, and it turns
he
out
does use a word processor these days.
I'm sure.
I also noticed that after he started using a word processor, his novels got longer.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. Right. So he was a typewriter guy, and being a typewriter guy, especially back then, made you prolific in a certain way. Right.
Yeah. If you were good at it, right? If you were good.
Yeah. It weeded people out too. It kept a lot of people. Like I probably never would have been a writer in the typewriter days. Right. I mean, I would have never overcome the hump. I would have gone into film or something earlier, I think, probably.
You'd still like to, wouldn't you, really? If you had that route to get the films out there, you would delight in getting your stuff across that way.
I would. Well, I do the videos, now, and that almost feels like I'm making like art films or something. Yeah, no, I would love to make a film or 2 or 3 or whatever. Yeah.
I think once you start down that path, there's no turning back, though.
Well, I'm a little old for the game, but yeah, I'd still love to do it. So in any case,
Chaplin was still making movies when he was 80, I think.
Yeah, but he didn't start at 80. So, yeah, okay. So the question I want to ask you is, well, you start your first video by showing us these pictures from protests. People can look forward to seeing this. And one way to think about this is that even though they're all pictures of basically the same thing, a group of people protesting, they are also like snapshots of completely different worlds.
Yes.
Some of which are connected to each other, and some of which are not. The people who are at the protests probably are as different from each other as a word processor writer and a typewriter writer.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
And you kind of raised that point. How does knowing that help us if we're on the left and we want to create a broader movement, if we want to change? It just seems like we're fragmented by technology.
Yeah, you're picking up on exactly the themes that I'm trying to get across through that collage of images, because there was a point, and it wasn't that long ago, it was 50, 60 years ago, that the left functioned successfully as a movement, because although different people had different political needs, there was a solidarity between everybody who was needing to politically campaign for change that enabled them to work together, right? So it's like I randomly can't keep away from looking at Martin Luther King stuff. I've been looking at the march in Selma this week, and the fact that after that disastrous first march, there was this call for aid, and it's basically a call to the clergy and people from all sorts of denominations, up to and including Greek Orthodox, turn up to march for black rights in Alabama. The people who are turning up have no stake in this personally, but they have solidarity with the black protesters, and that ability to have solidarity across different movements seems to be something that if we haven't completely lost, then we're in danger of completely losing it, right? We've fragmented, as you said. I think that's a brilliant diagnosis of the problem. We've fragmented into these camps, and identity politics gets wheeled out as an excuse for this. But I think if identity politics are toxic to solidarity, then identity politics are toxic to the left as it once was. And this seems to me a disastrous course to go on. And I'm really keen, if it's possible, to recover some of the sense of solidarity that says, I may not stand to benefit from what you're campaigning for, but I support your needs to push for this. Do you see what I mean? It's it's that willingness to, at the very least, not take a position of umbrage against some of these positions. And it's so polarized. And that image in the first episode, I think, sums it up quite nicely, because there's 4 different protests there, and it's really hard to imagine that anyone watching is not going to pick out on one of those and be absolutely not. That's outrageous. That's unacceptable, right? I mean, how was it for you? Were you did you find all 4 of those gave you no issue?
Well, I didn't particularly identify with any of them. So
is that because at heart you still cling to your sort of Marxist roots?
Yeah, I mean, where was if it had been Occupy or something, aimed at capitalism more directly, I would have maybe felt more of an affinity. But what was it? It was Black Lives Matter. Of course, I'm sympathetic to Black Lives Matter. There was one for trans solidarity, trans rights. Sympathetic to that. Then there was one that was about gender, like it was about gays and lesbians, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And then there was the vaccine.
The pass sanitaire protests in France. Yeah.
And I'm actually can find my way to be sympathetic to all of them. Strangely.
Well, congratulations, because I suspect that you're massively in the minority. And I'm not a Marxist myself and never have been, but I've got a great love for the Marxists who are willing to embrace that sense of universal solidarity that at its best has motivated Marxism. Mm-hmm. I'm afraid my general sense of this is that it's too difficult for the Marxists to get traction in a wider context now, because it's so easy to find ways to trash Marxism, if that makes any sense. The right in the US, for instance, immediately goes to all of the terrible things that came out of the USSR and uses that to trash Marxism. And I can understand why they do it, but
we've got a simple solution for that. Those people all belong in the gulag. Listen, I want to, I don't need to, I don't want to really defend Marxism for right now, but I don't want to get diverted about Marxism, but because I want to ask you about your main position. I want to question it a little bit, because the universalism that you're advocating for, which I think Marxism does actually work within the Enlightenment tradition. It comes out of the Enlightenment
absolutely
tradition. Yeah. But what people would tell me, they tell you, is look, you're a couple of white guys. Of course, you're for a universal politics because your race, your sex has taken the universal position. So a white male is just a person, right? Not defined by their whiteness, not defined by their gender. But in fact, because their gender is dominant, because their race is dominant, that's what gives them the freedom or the ability to claim that universal position. But for a black lesbian in 1974, resisting a universalist politics and embracing an identity politics was the way forward, at least for the Combahee River Collective. You ever heard of this group?
I haven't. No.
They it's like 1974. They named their resistance group after Harriet Tubman. They've been influential lately in the last 5 years or so. They've been picked up again, written about, and they had a statement saying we have to distinguish our struggle as lesbian black women from the struggle of white women, from the struggle of straight women, and certainly from the struggle of white men, because white men have dominated and oppressed us the most out of anyone.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure that's entirely true in 1974. It certainly was probably true in the past. In the United States, under before the Civil War, obviously there was a domination of black women, by white men that was, reprehensible to the extreme and disgusting and part of the slave trade, and common. So that's all true. So what would you say to someone that says, look, in order to defend myself from a society which is racist, which takes whiteness to be the norm, I have to develop an identity politics and an affinity group outside of the mainstream of society?
I'm sympathetic, because I think the thing is, if you're going to pursue a movement, then that movement is about something, right? I gave the example of the march from Selma. That was about specific issues affecting the Black community in the south of the US. There were specific issues being addressed by that march. You don't march for what you're calling universalist positions. But if you don't have those universalist positions in your back pocket, then you cannot pursue a successful movement. Because what Dr. King understood and what Gandhi understood with their nonviolent resistance campaigns was that the end point was reconciliation with the people who were opposing them. And if that reconciliation could not be attained, then the movement could never succeed. So it is a disaster to take on something that you think is a movement that is going to demonize some enemy and never be able to reconcile with them. Such a thing is not really a movement, in my view, and certainly is doomed to either failure or colossal entrenchment.
Well, but to take them, the difference there is that in the civil rights movement, they did want reconciliation because what they were hoping to gain was access and equity within the nation, right? As equal citizens. That's what the civil rights movement was about. It was about.
But they'd already, under the law, had been granted that equal status, but they weren't getting it because the sort of de facto conditions on the ground meant.
Well, there's still segregation was still allowed.
But the point was they'd already been granted voting rights, for instance, under the law, but it was laughably simple to deny those voting rights in practice, right?
Right. Yeah. But the point is that they were not trying to overturn the U.S. state, for instance, or get rid of the position of president or the Senate. They were attempting to get access to it and stop being oppressed and being allowed to be full participants in the system as it was. But when you're trying to overcome slavery, or you're trying to overcome what you perceive to be fundamentally sexist institution, like for the River Collective, Komahi River Collective, like marriage, you don't want to reconcile. You want to defeat. You want to defeat the slaveholders. You want to defeat the husbands. You want I say this as a recently divorced man. You want to you want to overcome wage slavery and the capitalist class. You don't want to be reconciled to them.
Yes, well, that's all very well, but are you actually going to succeed in pursuing something in which there isn't some common world afterwards? In particular, if your goal is to overthrow wealthy elites, and you intend to come into this with a plan whereby they are going to be, I don't know, rounded up and made to live in ghettos, say, you are going to have an immense struggle, a far wider struggle than if your goal is founded on some notion of equality, because you not only have to, as you put it, defeat these people with infinitely more power with you, but you want them to switch places with you. That's the basis of revolution. And
but you don't not when you're okay. Right. I mean, there's that's a great answer, because obviously when you're overturning slavery, the slaves were not saying we want to enslave another group instead. Right. Yeah. Obviously, when you're
and I have a shout out to the Quakers who more than anybody really pushed for the abolition of slavery, and in my view, don't get enough get enough of a mention on that abolition of slavery issue. They really worked really hard on an issue that everyone around them did not share their views. So I just briefly want to put a shout out to the Quakers, who I think are an amazing bunch.
Yeah, Richard Nixon sort of gave them a bad name. He was a Quaker. So
Richard Nixon is a Quaker. Wow.
I think he was very.
Nixon at the time seemed like the worst president ever, but of course we've seen into the future. Now we've got so many bad presidents to choose from.
Yeah, he was born into a family of Quakers. Richard Nixon was. So,
well, as with any identity that you want to pick out, you can't expect them all to be good, right?
right. I'm just giving you trouble. Okay. Yeah. So I do think that is a good answer. So as we work to defeat the institutions of corruption and oppression and injustice that surround us today, we also have to be able to envision a universalist system that may not be truly universal, because it seems like there's always, that's the other thing I'd want to raise, is like, it seems like every system of belonging implies an outsider. Every time you try to create whether it's a nation or just a club, you are usually finding someone that you're not only like not allowing in is not part of the group, but also possibly even an enemy.
I say more or less the same in chaos ethics when I talk about equality as exclusion. In order to have a class of equality, a group of things, people or whatever, that are equal, there must be something excluded from it. You're not going to get a meaningful kind of equality that includes everything, if you see what I mean. Equal rights for toasters might well be something that people are campaigning for in 100 years' time. But nonetheless, whenever you're going to be talking about equality, there's going to be some level of exclusion. And I think it's important, therefore, that we're always open for who might need to knock on the door and ask to come in, if you see what I mean. In an attempt to close these things down forever and to say once and for all, this is how it's going to be, just simply isn't going to work. You have to always be open to who might still be excluded. And I like to think in terms of collectives, if you see what I mean. And they have to be open. They don't all have to be open. I don't think that the Amish should be obligated to accept everybody into their farming community, but the collectives that collect the collectives need to always be open to the possibility that not everybody who needs to have equal status in the larger community is able to get that yet. And we need to be able to listen to where that's failing as well. We have to be willing to listen to what people have to say about these issues.
Yeah. Yesterday, I talked to or released a video where I was talking to a YouTuber his name is Greg, but he goes by J-Reg or Junior Egg, and whatever. Sometimes he says his name is J Gay, whatever he can think of to make it different each time. Anyway, I was interviewing him. My son was participating. It was a show we do called Zoomer Philosophy, and
shameless plug. This.
Yeah, and anyway, in the course of the conversation, we discussed the video he had made, J-Reg, Junior Egg had made, where he ranked all of the genders that there are by their flags, and there were hundreds of them. Chris, hundreds of genders. There were things like chicken nugget gender and cat gender and arson gender and post-traumatic stress disorder, the gender.
Yes.
So I want to know do you think that the proliferation of genders is a way of trying to be open and inclusive and bring everyone into the collection of collections, or is it a way to fragment and differentiate and break down?
It's both.
Okay.
It's both. On the one hand, I think the positive aspect of this queering of gender, which Judith Butler has more or less kicked off channeling Foucault, which is astonishing moment in itself. But on the one hand, this attempt to queer gender is an attempt at opening the doors to all the possibilities. Mm-hmm. But unfortunately, it also it tends to have involved a sort of denial of what I tend to call complementarity, which is the classical idea of the male and female complementary genders, right? It's absolutely central to almost all of the major world religions, some aspect of this complementarity. No, actually not all the major world religions, but a large number of the major world religions have complementarity built in there in some way. And it's how most people think about gender to this day. So on the one hand, yes, the queering of gender opens the floodgates and says, come on in, whatever your gender position is, which is fantastic. But if it's also excluding conversations with the people who are still operating with complementarity, then it's got problems, right? Because what's your end goal? If you're just forming a little bubble culture off by the side, we want to accept everybody who's enormously uncomfortable with complementarity, and there's dozens, if not tens of thousands of reasons why you might have issues with it, right? Mm-hmm. I don't want to suggest that any of our social institutions are immune from criticism. But again, this is the lived experience of a huge number of people. So if you want to live alongside those people, you also need to be aware of what complementarity is doing for them and be willing to have the conversation with them. And as far as I can see, nobody really wants to do it. Nobody wants to do it. The attitude is all smash traditional gender. And it's just like, well, lots of people are using that traditional gender. Maybe you could fulfill your inclusiveness goals without having to, take on a different gender tool, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I want to put this to you in a different way, kind of look at it. For the same idea, different issue, because along with ranking all the genders that there are, he also took all the ideology.
I'm insanely curious now.
His number one gender was called Greg gender, which is his gender.
Yes. Okay. And that in itself tells us something about what's going on there, I think.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Go on.
Okay. So, So he also did a tier listing of ideologies, all the different kinds of ideologies that you can be, like an anarcho, Nazbol communist, or whatever it might be. So, and he put them up on a tier chart. I don't remember what was the top tier ideology. Probably it was centrism, or maybe that was the bottom tier one. But what I thought about when I was watching your videos was that you seem to be thinking that all these different ideologies are kind of they're cutting us off from each other, and they're very influential. That they will determine how we interpret the world before we get a chance to think and interpret the world for ourselves.
I think that is a risk that goes with these things, and it's not a new risk. This is a long-standing risk for any culture that begins to assert itself, right?
Right, but I just was thinking that today, I mean, look, actually 10, 15 years ago, 15 years ago, let's say, Slavoj Žižek used to go around touring and say to people, look, we're supposed to be living in a postmodern era, and post-ideological era where nothing is fixed and we're all free from all these labels. And yet I believe we are more ideological than ever. And he would give a demonstration of this and prove it, or at least argue for it in his lecture. But today, everyone kind of knows we're more ideological than ever. And it is a change. I mean, as far back as the 50s, and certainly after 1989, there was a sense that we had left the era of ideologies behind us. In the 50s, for one reason, but basically, there was the same reason twice over. It was in the 50s, it was because of the death of Marxism and communism after like the Khrushchev speech about Stalin, and after the reality of the failure of the Soviet Union could no longer be denied back in the 50s. And then after 1989, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, again, that it was a death of ideology. Whereas now today we have ideology back with a vengeance, but it's like it's on a tier list and it's all in 100,000 different directions. So what
does it tell you about that 50s discussion that it focused entirely on Russia and that China didn't come into the question at all? China, probably the biggest winner in World War II, who we don't like to admit actually came out of World War II in a better position than other. Better's the wrong word, because nobody comes out of a horrible international conflict with anything other than sorrow. But the political position on the world stage of China was improved by World War II and was not set back in the way that various other places was. The attempt to rebuild after World War II, Moorcock writes about this quite passionately, was a hugely positive thing in the 50s in London, where Moorcock lived at the time. And it was starting to be threatened in the 60s, and it was falling apart in the 70s. And by the 80s, he wrote a fantastic essay, which I hardly recommend to anyone can get hold of a copy of it, called The Retreat from Liberty in the 80s, that I feel that the issues that he was writing about in the 80s have only become more relevant today. Mm-hmm. I think all of these ideas that we translate. I mean, you went to Zizek. You, as a Marxist, you've got to go to Zizek. He's your Marxist hero philosopher, right? He's the place one of them. To go. But, the whole run through the 20th century. Was it 79? Jean-Francois Lyotard has the postmodern condition and kicks off this stuff, and he's basically saying, the age of grand narratives is over. And it's just, well, that's a grand narrative right there. It's the grand narrative that the age of grand narratives is over. It's right. You don't escape from human mythology, because we live inside of mythologies. Our mythologies make up the worlds that we live in. And we love to think that they're absolutely real and true. And that's where all the trouble comes, right? And it's not that there aren't truths. It's that the stuff that we feel most strongly is undeniably true, probably doesn't cross between worlds, and so isn't that true at all. It's true within our world, but it's not true in the multiverse. Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
One of the things that I try to remind myself about, and this is not about ideologies and mythologies even, but about feelings, is that I've come to realize as I've gotten older, and it took me probably into my 30s before I really understood this, is that the profundity and the depth of my feelings did not indicate the solidity of my ideas. Like, I can be really upset about something, really angry, and absolutely wrong. And that just because the feeling of righteousness is not the same thing as being right.
I agree, but I think it's also dangerous if you ever get into the position whereby you want to equate emotions with lies, if that makes any sense. Because there's this danger, and it's embedded in everyday language, and it's a total distortion of the Enlightenment philosophy. But we'll use the word an objective opinion, for instance, or objective perspective. By which we mean nothing of the kind. There's this idea, for instance, this came up in a business discussion recently about, don't get your friends and family to give you feedback on your business plan because you won't get an objective judgment from them. Well, true, you won't get an objective judgment from them, but neither will you from anyone else, because business plans are not objects and they're not amenable to the kinds of objective knowledge that we can get, right? If you want to cost out how much to make a pair of shoes, you can get objective data on that, if you see what I mean. If you want to know the temperature that you want to melt an ice cube on top of Mount Everest, then you can get objective data on it. But a lot of the stuff that goes on in our worlds is not objective and is no less valuable because of it. In fact, objective data, objective content is rather less important than we like to pretend, right? I don't say that it doesn't matter, and I spend a lot of time looking at what can be objectively determined. But it's quite a thin part of the human experience that can be objectively determined, right? There's huge amounts of subjective experience that actually is meaningful and matters. I wrote a short book for Carnegie Mellon's Etc. Press, or ETC Press, I don't know how they prefer to say it, called Wikipedia Knows Nothing, which is available for free, and you can get it as a PDF. And I'm quite pleased with this text for what it is. But the whole idea that I wanted to put forward was that our understanding of knowledge as facts is misleading. Facts are more like the side effect of having knowledge, right? And our knowledge comes from our practices. It is the skills that we develop that give us knowledge of an area. And once we've got those skills, some facts will emerge from the fact that we've got those skills. And if you've also got those skills, you can verify that those facts are correct. But the facts are not as important as the practices, as the skills. So this idea of knowledge as a practice, which came out of discussions with Chris Billows, who I'm now fighting with, which is a real shame that he doesn't know yet. I'm probably going to find out watching this. But Chris, we will make up, I promise. We just, had a bad exchange on a highly inflammatory topic. We will get back in.
This is on Twitter? Was this on Twitter?
No, Chris is one of the few remaining people who will write blog letters to me. I really believe in letters as a form of communication because you can take your time to get over it. But we had an exchange of blog letters which failed to communicate. I feel, and I'm even as we speak trying to work out how to remount that conversation so that it might succeed.
Well, let me. I want to see if I can risk having a failure of communication with you right now. Get the blood boiling. I don't think I'm going to succeed, but look, I feel as though there are empirical facts and that there are facts of reason that that maybe you don't always have the empirical facts at hand. In fact, they're very difficult to get. Actual empirical facts. They're because everything is coming to you through an interpretation. I mean, a good example is just figuring out how many people died from COVID. Right? That should be just a simple empirical fact, but it's not. You can't just tell someone the number.
Will Uncle Google allow us to have a conversation of this kind? I'm curious.
I think we can. Yeah, I think we can now. I think we can now.
Oh, okay.
So,
well, that's kind of reassuring. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So, but on the other hand, you can know whether or not an argument is sound or valid. You can know whether or not you're dealing with a fallacy. You can know if you're just someone's just spouting specious nonsense. And when you are, and you discover that someone's say deploying a fallacy to make their argument, you can know that the fact is that that's a poor argument and it shouldn't justify their feelings. For that it doesn't mean that their feelings aren't a good starting point to then lead to thought, right? And to reason and to searching out facts, I would say. But it does mean that they're not reliable. They're not more reliable than reason, or anywhere near as reliable as interpretive reason.
I would be inclined to say that reason is less reliable than emotions if you look at the context in which these things are doing their judging. Because your emotions will accurately judge many things about your lived situation. The problem with the emotions comes, and this dovetails with that example image of the 4 protests in the first episode of Dr. Multiverse, that yes, your emotions will tell you stuff about your lived experience that you absolutely need to listen to. And some of the things your emotions are telling you will be true, right? They're not false. Equating emotions with falsity is a very dangerous way to distort the human experience. But we will project those emotions into all sorts of situations that are not our lived experience, and then they will betray us. They'll betray us because our emotional reactions are dressed up our intellectual judgments. And we get into so much trouble when we do this. And it drives these fault lines in contemporary conversation. And then obviously the political fault lines on the outside of them. It breaks my heart how poor the relationship between Democrats and Republicans is in the US now. I find it absolutely heartbreaking that all that happens in a US election now is that one side tries to defeat the other and then demolish whatever was done by the previous party previously. attempts to get agreements that transcend the fault lines in the politics have fallen out completely. And it seems as if, and I don't know if it's the politicians or the political advisors, dare not go against the position on the fault line that's been taken up for fear that vengeance will descend upon them from the electorate that has aligned behind that fault line. But this is a disaster. This is a political disaster. And I really, really value the US. I'm moving back there. It's my 5th international move, moving back to the US. As soon as the embassy will grant me my visa so I can return to the US, I will be moving back to live there. I really value the US and I really value its political achievements, but I really worry that it has driven its own politics into the ground. And although there are definitely problems in the system, right? There are always problems in political systems. I sense that this problem is not with the system at heart, but with the failure to communicate between these battle camps that have been drawn up. And there's, again, we talked about reconciliation previously. Reconciliation is a vital endpoint for a movement, but political parties that have no intention of reconciling over any of the issues that they're working towards are in a disastrous position. And it's not everyone. I see Democrats and I see Republicans in a position that they are willing to have the conversations, but there's enough people caught up in this who will not budge an inch on every issue that they've decided to put a spear in the ground over. And it's such a depressing situation. And I really feel that if the electorate could get those conversations going, we could make the situation better. Nothing poisons the US politics more effectively than each disastrous president in turn. It seems like every president is worse than the previous one, although we like to forgive the one that aligns with our political line. But disastrous stuff has happened under the watch of every US president in my lifetime. Terrible stuff. And all eyes on the president is not a political plan. It's not a plan to solve the problems of a country. Forget what's going on in Washington as best you can and try and have the conversation with the people who live in your community and work out what's right for where you are. If we could manage that, if we could get grassroots political discussions going, I believe the US could really turn a vitally needed corner. Do you disagree?
I don't disagree, but I think that it's a matter of overcoming the divide between voters and not between the parties. Like, we need another party, we need a socialist party, and we need.
You would say that as a Marxist. Of course you want a socialist party.
That's right. That's what I want. And I want to bring people who might think of themselves as Republican and people who might think of themselves as Democrats into it.
Did I hear correctly that Alaska and Maine have passed amounts to a proportional representation voting system?
Oh, I don't know.
This is a rumor that I heard, and I find very exciting because first past the post is part of the problem with a lot of political systems. Although I am mindful of the complaint that people make that first past the post at least makes governing possible. Although after watching what happened in the last 2 years, I think that is a ludicrous claim, frankly. Let's not go down that rabbit hole.
Well, anyway, I'm for proportional voting, but of course I am, because I would like to see a socialist party.
Yeah, because you'd like a socialist party. It's the thing that stopped the third parties coming through in the US was that the sense that if you voted for someone who wasn't one of the big corporate funded political parties, you were quote unquote wasting your vote, right?
That's part of it.
It's impossible to get any further representation in. So a proportional representation system whereby you can cast a vote for a minority candidate. If they don't get in, your vote will go on to prop up a corporate funded party, gives at least the possibility that you might get some smaller groups together. It's not so bad in the UK because we do have smaller political parties, although I won't say we don't have our own share of political problems because every country does, right?
Yeah. Well, Chris, I want to close us out here actually because we're coming up on an hour. But before we do,
this has been an hour.
Yeah, can you believe it?
Yeah, I feel like we barely started, Doug.
I know, but in the videos, look, people will have to. Your videos are dense and not like You've got a lot more in your 13-minute videos than we got through in this more meandering conversation. So people should go and watch them. But if I'm remembering correctly, I've heard a rumor anyway that you solved the trolley problem, and that you know the solution to the trolley problem. Is that true? What's the solution?
I wouldn't say that I solved it. I believe it's Alan Wood. Alan Wood is a moral philosopher and a Kantian and a staunch Democrat. And he's quite scary if you start talking about the Democrats, actually. But he's a lovely, lovely man in other contexts. I have all sorts of random intersections with people of minuscule fame. Alan Wood came to my lecture at the university that he's at and had an old man nap through it. He came along, which I was very touched that he came along, but then he took an old man nap in it, and that was, Alan Wood basically destroys the way trolley problems are deployed now, which is not how they were originally used, as I know you know.
Right.
The fourth part of this first run of Dr. Multiverse episodes is all about this. But my general sense is we are deeply confused about the different kinds of truths. And in particular, we will confuse mathematical truth for moral truth. The thing is, mathematical truths as logical truths are true, right? It is true that 2 + 2 = 4 in a standard number system, right? Mm-hmm. But it does not follow that imaginary situations in which you can say 4 is greater than 2 have any moral significance, or indeed that the moral significance they have is the one that the scenario that produced that suggests. And the way trolley problems are used now is a shorthand to push what's called in academic philosophy consequentialism, but which I might call mathematical idolatry, as a means of sidestepping any kind of moral deliberation whatsoever. And moral problems, by their very necessity as moral problems, are non-trivial. And anything that purports to make them simple is a deception. And trolley problems used in that way are immensely deceptive and incredibly dangerous and indeed murderous, as I believe I make the case in the fourth of these episodes.
Yep. All right. Well, people should look forward to that. And thanks for coming on. I will have you back on.
Before you sign off, Doug, if there's anyone watching who wants a slightly insane but cheerful guest, I'm more than happy to talk to anyone about more or less anything. So do get in touch if you would like a podcast guest.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. You're going to be a guest again, though, when these videos are done. I'll bring you back on.
I sincerely hope so. I really enjoy talking to you, Doug. It's always a great pleasure. It's ridiculous that it's been so long since we last spoke to each other. But to be fair, we've been very, very busy with other things. So.
That's right. Well, it won't be that long because we're going to run these videos and then we're going to see the reaction and you're going to come back with your tail between your legs. You're going to have to apologize to everybody.